babies crying. Stops global bear migration, they all turn around to help. The snow fell differently that night. Lily Morgan noticed it first through the frosted window of her cabin, each flake tumbling slower than it should, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath. She shifted her weight in the old rocking chair, the wood creaking beneath her as she adjusted the bundle in her arms. Her baby boy, barely 3 weeks old, had been crying for hours. Not the sharp, desperate cries that meant hunger or pain, but something else entirely. Something that made her chest tighten with a worry she couldn't name. The cabin sat 40 miles from the nearest town, tucked into a valley where cell towers couldn't reach, and electricity came from a generator that hummed like a tired old man. She had chosen this isolation deliberately after her husband's death 6 months ago, wanting nothing more than silence and space to grieve. But now, with the baby's cries echoing off the wooden walls, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Oh. The crying started again, louder this time, and Lily stood up, bouncing gently on her toes. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction, pine trees heavy with snow, their branches drooping like tired arms. She had no idea that at this exact moment, thousands of miles away, a man named Ethan Marshall was staring at his computer screen in complete disbelief. Ethan worked for the Global Wildlife Monitoring Initiative, a program that tracked animal migrations using satellite technology and thousands of motion sensors scattered across the planet. For the past 3 weeks, he had been monitoring something unprecedented. Every bear on Earth, from the massive Kodiak bears of Alaska to the small sun bears of Southeast Asia, had begun moving. Not randomly, not in their usual seasonal patterns, but all in the same direction, as if responding to a call only they could hear. The data didn't make sense. Polar bears had abandoned their hunting grounds, leaving seals untouched on the ice. Grizzlies had emerged from hibernation 3 months early, their cubs stumbling through snow they weren't ready for. Giant pandas had left their bamboo forests, something that went against every instinct they possessed. Even the spectacled bears of South America had begun their journey, crossing rivers and mountains with a determination that defied explanation. Ethan had presented his findings to his colleagues, but nobody could offer a reasonable theory. Climate change didn't explain it. Disease didn't explain it. Nothing in the scientific literature could account for this synchronized, global movement of an entire family of species. Back in the cabin, Lily walked to the window, her baby's cries growing stronger. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the snow fall. That's when she saw them. Tracks. Fresh tracks in the snow, circling her cabin. They were too large to be wolves, too round to be mountain lions. Her heart began to race as she followed the trail with her eyes, seeing how it wound around and around her home, like someone had been pacing, thinking, waiting. The baby's cry suddenly peaked, a sound so loud and clear that it seemed to pierce through the walls themselves. And then, silence, not just from the baby, but from everything. The wind stopped. The generator's hum faded. Even the snow seemed to pause mid-fall. Ethan's monitoring station erupted in alarms. Every single bear on his tracking system had stopped moving. Not gradually, not over the course of minutes, but instantly, as if someone had pressed pause on the entire species. His hands trembled as he pulled up the satellite feeds, zooming in on different locations around the globe. A polar bear standing on an ice floe, perfectly still, its head tilted as if listening. A group of black bears in the Appalachian Mountains, frozen mid-step on a mountain trail. Hundreds of grizzlies spread across the Canadian Rockies, all motionless, all facing the same direction. Southwest, they were all facing southwest. The silence in Lily's cabin stretched on for what felt like hours but was only seconds. Then her baby drew in a breath and let out another cry, this one different from before. It wasn't distressed or angry, it was almost musical, rising and falling in a pattern that reminded her of whale songs she had heard in a documentary years ago. As the sound filled the cabin, she noticed something impossible. The frost on the windows was melting, not from heat, but forming patterns as it ran down the glass. Spirals and curves that looked almost like writing, though in no language she recognized. Ethan watched his screens in amazement as every bear began moving again, but not continuing their original migration. They were turning. All of them simultaneously, adjusting their paths to converge on a single point. His fingers flew across the keyboard, calculating trajectories, estimating the convergence point. Northern Montana. A remote valley with no cities, no landmarks of significance. According to his maps, there was nothing there but wilderness and maybe a few scattered cabins. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Whatever was happening, he needed to see it for himself. His supervisor called after him, but Ethan didn't stop. Some things were bigger than protocol. The first bear arrived at Lily's cabin 3 hours after the crying incident. She saw it through the kitchen window while heating formula on the wood stove. A massive grizzly, its fur silvered with snow, sitting at the edge of the clearing. Just sitting, like a dog waiting for its owner. Her first instinct was fear, but something about its posture, the way it kept its distance while clearly watching the cabin, made her pause. The baby was quiet now, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. She watched the bear for 20 minutes, neither of them moving, until a second bear emerged from the tree line. This one was smaller, a black bear with a white patch on its chest. It sat down next to the grizzly, maintaining the same respectful distance. By morning, there were dozens. Lily had stayed awake all night, moving from window to window, watching them arrive. They came alone and in groups, each finding a spot in the ever-widening circle around her cabin. Grizzlies, black bears, and then, impossibly, a polar bear. She knew enough about wildlife to understand this shouldn't be happening. Polar bears didn't travel this far south. Different species of bears didn't congregate peacefully. Yet here they were, sitting in the snow like an audience waiting for a performance to begin. The baby stirred in his crib, making soft cooing sounds, and she noticed the bear's ears all swiveled toward the sound. Ethan drove through the night, following GPS coordinates and instinct when the roads ran out. He had to abandon his truck 5 miles from the convergence point, continuing on foot through deep snow. His satellite phone buzzed constantly with calls from his team, from news agencies who had somehow gotten word of the phenomenon, from government officials demanding explanations he didn't have. He turned it off. As he climbed the final ridge, he heard it. A low humming sound, so deep he felt it in his chest more than heard it with his ears. When he reached the top and looked down into the valley, he had to sit down in the snow, his legs suddenly unable to support him. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Every species of bear that existed, arranged in concentric circles around a small cabin. The humming was coming from them, a sound unlike anything in any wildlife recording he had ever heard. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was almost like singing, if bears could sing. Each species seemed to contribute a different tone, creating a harmony that made his eyes water with its strange beauty. In the center of it all, barely visible through the sea of fur and breath fog, was the cabin. Smoke rose from its chimney, the only sign that someone was inside. Someone at the center of the most extraordinary wildlife event in recorded history. Lily had stopped being afraid hours ago. The bears hadn't moved closer, hadn't shown any signs of aggression. They just sat there, occasionally shifting position, their eyes always on the cabin. When the baby woke and began to fuss, she noticed their humming grew louder, and amazingly it seemed to calm him. She carried him to the window, letting him see the gathering. His tiny eyes, still learning to focus, seemed to track the movement outside. Then he made a sound, a happy gurgling noise that babies make when they're content, and every single bear stood up. Her heart stopped, but they didn't advance. They stood for a moment as if paying respect, then sat back down. Ethan made his way down the slope carefully, expecting at any moment for the bears to notice him and react. But they didn't. He walked between them, close enough to touch their fur, and they simply watched him pass. Some even moved aside to let him through, their movements deliberate and careful. As he got closer to the cabin, he could hear something else beneath the humming, a baby's laughter. Clear and bright, it seemed to dance with the bear's song, creating a melody that made no sense and yet felt perfectly right. He reached the cabin's door and knocked gently. Lily opened the door holding her baby, and Ethan saw her eyes were red from crying, though she was smiling. "Are you here to explain this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, unable to speak for a moment. The baby looked at him with those ancient eyes that all newborns have, as if they still remember something the rest of us have forgotten. "I'm Ethan Marshall," he finally managed. "I've been tracking them, all of them. They came here for him, didn't they?" Lily nodded, though she didn't understand how she knew this to be true. "His name is Connor," she said. "Connor Adams. His father's name. His father died before he was born." They stood together in the doorway, watching the bears. Ethan pulled out his equipment, not to study or document, but just to confirm what his eyes were seeing. According to his readings, bears were still arriving. Some had traveled thousands of miles, crossing oceans and continents. Polar bears had swum further than should be possible. Pandas had walked until their feet bled, then kept walking. Sun bears had left the only homes they'd ever known. All for this moment, this gathering, this child. "Why?" Lily asked, though she wasn't sure she was asking Ethan or the universe itself. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but I think sometimes nature knows things we don't, recognizes things we can't." As the sun began to set, painting the snow pink and gold, the humming changed. It grew more complex, more layered. Each bear seemed to be contributing something unique to the sound, creating a lullaby unlike anything human ears had ever heard. Connor had been awake for hours without crying, seemingly entranced by the sound. His little hands reached toward the window, fingers spreading like he was trying to touch the music itself. Lily found herself crying again, not from sadness or fear, but from something else. A feeling that she was witnessing something sacred, something that would never be repeated. Ethan had given up trying to make scientific sense of it. His instruments showed impossible readings, body temperatures that didn't match species norms, electromagnetic fields that shouldn't exist, brain activity patterns that suggested a level of consciousness and communication between species that challenged everything he thought he knew about animal behavior. But more than that, he felt it. Whatever was happening here wasn't meant to be dissected and analyzed. It was meant to be experienced, to be felt, to be remembered. He thought about all the people frantically calling him, wanting explanations, wanting to study this, to understand it. But standing here, watching a baby and 1,000 bears share something beyond words, he knew that some things were meant to remain mysteries. The night grew deeper, but the bears didn't sleep. They maintained their vigil, their humming continuing like the earth's own heartbeat. Lily had moved a chair to the window, holding Connor so he could see out. He had been quiet for hours, not sleeping, but in some state between waking and dreaming. His eyes reflected the moonlight, making them seem almost luminous. Around midnight, something changed. The humming stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the world had paused. Then Connor laughed. Not a small baby giggle, but a full, joyous laugh that seemed impossible from such tiny lungs. The bears responded immediately. They stood again, but this time they began to move. Not toward the cabin, but in a slow, choreographed dance around it. Each circle of bears rotated in opposite directions, creating a living mandala in the snow. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, as if they had rehearsed this moment for generations. Ethan grabbed his camera, not for science, but because he knew human eyes alone wouldn't be enough to hold this memory. The dance continued for exactly 1 hour, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The bears returned to their sitting positions, but something had changed. The air felt different, charged with possibility. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening in increments so gradual that it was impossible to say when night ended and day began. Connor had finally fallen asleep, his tiny body exhausted from whatever had passed between him and the gathered bears. Lily's arms ached from holding him, but she didn't want to put him down, afraid that if she did, the spell would break and the bears would leave. But they showed no signs of departing. If anything, they seemed more settled, more permanent, like they had become part of the landscape itself. Ethan had been documenting everything, not with scientific detachment, but with the reverence of someone recording a miracle. He had hours of footage, thousands of photographs, readings that would baffle scientists for decades. But he knew that none of it would truly capture what had happened here. How could you quantify the feeling of standing between species, of watching boundaries dissolve, of seeing nature itself recognize something in a human child that humans themselves couldn't name? He thought about evolution, about the connections between all living things, about the ancient contracts between humans and animals that civilization had made us forget. By the second evening, news of the gathering had spread. Helicopters circled overhead, their noise an ugly intrusion into the sacred quiet. The bears looked up at them but didn't flee. They seemed to understand that this moment was bigger than their own instinct for self-preservation. Lily watched the helicopters with growing anger. She knew what would come next. Scientists, government officials, people who would want to study Connor, to understand what made him special. People who would try to reduce this miracle to data points and theories. She held him tighter, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. But then something unexpected happened. The bears began to sing again, their humming growing louder, more insistent. The sound rose up, creating an acoustic phenomenon that Ethan's equipment registered as a standing wave, a wall of sound that somehow interfered with the helicopter's instruments. One by one, they were forced to retreat, their pilots reporting equipment failures that would later be dismissed as impossible. The bears continued their song until the sky was clear again, then settled back into their patient watching. On the third day, Connor woke with a fever. Not dangerous, but enough to worry Lily. She had no way to get to a doctor, no way to call for help that wouldn't bring the chaos she was trying to avoid. But as she held him, pacing the small cabin, the bear's humming shifted again. It became softer, more focused, and impossibly, Connor's temperature began to drop. Within an hour, the fever was gone, leaving him cooler to the touch than before, but somehow healthier looking, his cheeks pink with a vitality that seemed to glow from within. Lily looked at Ethan, who had been watching with the same amazement. "They're taking care of him," she whispered. "They're actually taking care of him." The realization changed everything. This wasn't just a gathering, wasn't just some inexplicable animal behavior. The bears had come to protect, to nurture, to participate in something that connected all life. Ethan thought about all the stories he'd dismissed as mythology. Tales of children raised by wolves, of animals recognizing human souls, of the natural world responding to human need in ways that defied scientific explanation. He had always believed these were just stories, ways for humans to feel less alone in the universe. But now, watching 1,000 bears tend to a human infant with more care than many humans showed their own young, he understood that mythology might just be another word for truths we've forgotten how to see. Days passed in a rhythm that felt both eternal and fleeting. The bears maintained their vigil, rotating positions so those who had been in the outer circles could move closer, each taking their turn in proximity to the cabin. They foraged at night, always leaving some on guard, returning with frost on their fur and purpose in their movements. Connor grew stronger, more alert. His cries, when they came, were immediately answered by the bears humming, creating a call and response that sounded like the earth itself learning to speak. Lily found herself sleeping better than she had since her husband's death, the presence of the bears paradoxically making her feel safer than any lock or wall ever could. Ethan had stopped trying to document everything. Instead, he simply lived it, helped Lily with daily tasks, played his part in whatever this was. He learned to interpret the bears' different sounds, the way their humming shifted to indicate weather changes or the approach of other animals. Wolves came to the edge of the clearing once, drawn by curiosity, but the bears' unified stance sent them retreating without conflict. Even the ravens seemed to understand something momentous was happening, perching in the trees and maintaining an unusual silence, their black eyes watching with what almost looked like reverence. On the 7th day, Connor spoke. Not words, because 3-week-old babies don't speak words. But he made a sound that was unmistakably intentional, directed at the bears. It was a low rumble, impossible from such a small throat, yet there it was. Every bear responded, their own rumbles creating a symphony that shook snow from the trees. Lily laughed and cried simultaneously, beyond trying to understand, simply accepting that her son was part of something larger than human comprehension. Ethan recorded it, knowing no one would believe it, knowing it didn't matter if they did. The changes in Connor were subtle but undeniable. His eyes, which should have been struggling to focus at his age, tracked movement with unusual precision. His hands, which should have been randomly grasping, seemed to reach with intention toward the window whenever the bears sang. Most remarkably, he never cried from hunger when the bears were humming, as if their sound provided some form of nourishment that transcended the physical. Lily still fed him, of course, but noticed he needed less, seemed satisfied with less, as if he was drawing sustenance from the connection itself. On the 10th day, the first bear left. A small sun bear who had traveled from Malaysia, it stood, bowed its head toward the cabin in what could only be described as a gesture of respect, and walked away. Others followed gradually, not in a rush, but with the same deliberate purpose that had brought them. Each departure was marked by that same head bow, that same moment of acknowledgement. The circles grew smaller, but the remaining bears adjusted their positions to maintain the pattern. The humming continued, though with fewer voices it became something more intimate, more personal. Lily understood without being told that this was ending, that whatever had needed to happen had happened. She felt a grief she couldn't explain, knowing she would miss these silent guardians who had asked nothing of her but to let them bear witness to her son. She held Connor at the window, letting him see each departure, and he watched with those impossible ancient eyes, seeming to understand in his infant way that something important was concluding. Ethan stood beside them, his hand on Lily's shoulder, sharing the weight of the moment. By the 15th day, only a dozen bears remained. The largest grizzly, the first one Lily had seen, seemed to be their unofficial leader. The polar bear, so far from home, showed no signs of distress despite the relatively warm temperature. A giant panda sat with bamboo shoots that Ethan couldn't fathom how it had found, munching thoughtfully while maintaining its watch. These last guardians seemed different from the others, more permanent, as if they had chosen to stay not just for Connor but for something longer term. That night, Connor cried again for the first time in days. But this cry was different. It wasn't distress or need, it was a call, clear and purposeful. The remaining bears stood and approached the cabin, closer than they had ever come. Lily's instinct was to step back, but something in their movement, slow and careful, kept her at the window. They formed a tight circle around the cabin, close enough that she could see the individual hairs on their fur, the breath misting from their nostrils. Then they sang. Not hummed, but truly sang. A sound that had melody and harmony and something that might have been words in a language older than human speech. The song lasted until dawn, and when it ended, Connor was asleep, a smile on his tiny face that looked impossibly knowing. The bears stepped back, returned to their original positions, but the air between them and the cabin had changed. It was no longer a separation but a connection, invisible but undeniable. Ethan, who had given up trying to explain any of this scientifically, found himself thinking about quantum entanglement, about particles that remained connected across impossible distances. Maybe, he thought, consciousness worked the same way. Maybe what had happened here was the entangling of awareness that would persist long after the bears had gone. More days passed, and more bears left, each departure feeling like a goodbye to an old friend. The helicopters had stopped coming. The news cycle had moved on to other mysteries, other crises. But Ethan knew the scientific community was in uproar. His data, what little he had shared, had challenged fundamental assumptions about animal cognition, about the boundaries between species, about the nature of consciousness itself. Conferences were being organized, papers were being written, theories were being proposed. None of them would come close to the truth, because the truth wasn't something that could be captured in equations or hypotheses. When only 3 bears remained, the grizzly, the polar bear, and surprisingly a small spectacled bear from South America, Lily knew it was almost over. Connor was 3 weeks older now, showing development that pediatricians would have called impossible. He could hold his head up steadily, his eyes tracked with perfect accuracy, and when he vocalized, it was with a range and intentionality that suggested language just beyond the edge of forming. The 3 bears had moved closer, spending their days just outside the cabin windows, their presence now feeling less like a vigil and more like family. On the 21st day, Lily woke to silence. The ever-present humming that had become the soundtrack to their lives had stopped. She rushed to the window, Connor in her arms, to find the 3 bears standing in a line facing the cabin. They were leaving. She knew it instantly. But first, something else needed to happen. She wrapped Connor in blankets and, for the first time since this began, opened the cabin door and stepped outside. The cold hit her immediately, but Connor didn't cry. He looked at the bears with those impossible eyes and made a sound that was almost a word. Almost thank you, though in no language humans spoke. The polar bear approached first, slow and careful, stopping just out of arm's reach. It lowered its massive head, and Connor reached out one tiny hand, his fingers barely brushing the bear's nose. The moment of contact lasted less than a second, but Lily felt something pass between them, a transfer of something that had no name. The spectacled bear came next, smaller, more tentative, touching its nose to Connor's outstretched hand with the delicacy of a butterfly landing. Finally, the grizzly, the first and last, approached. This time, Connor made that rumbling sound again, and the grizzly responded in kind, a conversation in frequencies that human ears could barely detect. Then they left. No ceremony, no lingering. They simply turned and walked into the forest, their forms disappearing into the shadows between the trees. Lily stood in the snow, holding her son, watching the empty space where they had been. Ethan stood beside her, and together they remained there long after the cold should have driven them inside, honoring the conclusion of something that would never be repeated. When they finally went back into the cabin, it felt smaller, quieter, but also somehow larger, as if the walls had absorbed some of the vastness of what had occurred. In the days that followed, life returned to something resembling normal. Lily cared for Connor, who continued to develop in ways that delighted and mystified her. Ethan stayed for another week, helping with repairs to the cabin, splitting wood, sharing meals. They talked about what had happened, but more often they sat in comfortable silence, two people who had shared something that set them apart from the rest of humanity. When he finally left, promising to keep in touch, to protect their privacy as much as possible, Lily knew he would keep his word. Some bonds were forged in the ordinary, others in the extraordinary. The scientific community continued to struggle with Ethan's data. Papers were published and refuted. Theories were proposed and dismissed. The footage he had shared was analyzed frame by frame, declared both authentic and impossible. Some scientists proposed mass hallucination. Others suggested a new form of animal communication triggered by environmental factors. A few brave souls suggested something more, something about consciousness and connection that science wasn't yet equipped to understand. But for every theory, there were a dozen questions that couldn't be answered. Connor grew. By 6 months, he was walking, though doctors insisted this was impossible. By his first birthday, he was speaking in complete sentences, his vocabulary peppered with sounds that weren't quite words but seemed to carry meaning. He would stand at windows for hours, watching the forest, occasionally making that low, rumbling sound that had no human equivalent. Animals were drawn to him. Birds would land on his outstretched hands. Deer would approach when he played in the yard. Once, Lily saw a wolf at the edge of the clearing, watching Connor play before it melted back into the forest. The bears never returned, not altogether. But sometimes in the early morning or late evening, Lily would see a single bear at the edge of the clearing. Always at a distance, always brief, but unmistakably checking. Checking on Connor, on them, on the connection that had been forged in those 3 weeks. Connor always seemed to know when they were there, even when he couldn't see them. He would stop what he was doing, turn toward the forest, and make that rumbling sound. And always, from somewhere in the distance, an answer would come. Ethan visited twice a year, bringing supplies and news from the outside world. The phenomenon had passed into legend despite the evidence. People had moved on to other mysteries, other wonders, but in certain scientific circles, it had changed everything. Studies on animal cognition had taken new directions. Research into interspecies communication had received funding that would have been laughable before. The word consciousness was being applied to non-human life in ways that would have been heretical just years before. The bears had left more than memories. They had left questions that would reshape how humanity understood its place in the living world. On Connor's 2nd birthday, something extraordinary happened. Lily woke to find him standing at the window, and outside, sitting in the exact spot where it had all begun, was the grizzly. Just the one, silvered now with more age, but unmistakably the same bear. Connor placed his small hand on the window, and the bear placed its paw on the other side, matching the position perfectly. They stayed like that for a long moment, and Lily saw something pass between them again, that same indefinable exchange she had witnessed 2 years before. Then the bear stood, bowed its head as it had when leaving, and walked away. Connor watched until it disappeared, then turned to his mother with eyes that held too much understanding for a 2-year-old. Life continued. Connor grew into a child unlike any other, though Lily was careful to help him understand the need to blend in, to not display too openly the gifts the bears had left him with. He learned to speak normally, though sometimes she caught him humming in harmonies that no human throat should produce. He went to school eventually, made friends, lived something approaching a normal life. But always, there was something different about him. A stillness, a way of listening that suggested he heard things others didn't, a connection to the natural world that went beyond interest or affinity. Ethan became a close family friend, uncle to Connor in all but blood. He had written a book about the event, carefully crafted to protect their identities while sharing what needed to be shared. It was dismissed by many as fiction disguised as fact, embraced by others as proof of what they had always suspected, that the boundaries between human and nature were far more permeable than modern life suggested. He continued his research, finding other anomalies, other moments when animals behaved in ways that suggested awareness beyond current understanding. But nothing ever matched those 3 weeks in Montana. When Connor was 5, old enough to understand more complex ideas, Lily finally asked him if he remembered the bears. He looked at her with those eyes that still held traces of ancient wisdom and said, "They're still here, Mom. They never really left. They just spread out, keeping watch from far away. They said I would need them again someday, and they would know when." She didn't ask what he meant, didn't ask how he knew. Some knowledge came from places that questions couldn't reach. Instead, she held him close. This miraculous child who had brought together species and challenged the very notion of what connection meant. The years passed with a quality of held breath, as if the world was waiting for something. Connor grew tall and strong, his connection to nature deepening rather than fading with age. He could calm aggressive dogs with a look, could call birds from the sky with a whistle that wasn't quite a whistle. He knew when storms were coming days before the weather service predicted them. He knew when animals were sick or injured, often leading Lily to creatures in need of help. The local veterinarian joked that Connor was better at diagnosis than most trained professionals, though the joke held an edge of unease. When Connor was 7, the dreams started. He would wake speaking in that rumbling language, the one the bears had taught him without teaching. He drew pictures of places he had never been, landscapes that Lily later identified as the Arctic, the Amazon, mountain ranges in Asia. All places where bears lived, all places that seemed to be calling to him. She knew, with a mother's intuition, that something was building, that the connection forged in his infancy was pulling towards some new purpose. But she didn't know what, and Connor, for all his unusual abilities, couldn't explain it either. Ethan noticed it, too, during his visits. The way Connor would suddenly stop mid-conversation, his head tilted as if listening to something. The way he would sometimes respond to questions that hadn't been asked aloud. The way animals began gathering again, not in the massive numbers of that first event, but steadily. A fox denning unusually close to the cabin. An owl that roosted in the same tree every night, its eyes always on Connor's window. The increasing frequency of bear sightings, always at a distance, always watching. Then came the day when Connor was 8, and the world shifted again. He woke, not crying but singing. The same harmonic humming the bears had produced. Lily found him at the window, and outside, just like that first morning years ago, sat a bear. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were a dozen, all different species again, arranged in a small circle. Connor looked at his mother with eyes that were apologetic and determined in equal measure. "They need me to come with them," he said simply. "Not forever, just for a while. There's something I need to learn, something only they can teach." The thought of letting her 8-year-old son go with wild bears should have been unthinkable. Every maternal instinct should have screamed against it. But Lily looked at the bears, patient and waiting, and remembered the 3 weeks when they had been more gentle with her infant than most humans were with their own children. She remembered the fever they had cured, the lullabies they had sung, the protection they had provided. These weren't wild animals in the way humans understood wildness. They were something else, something older and wiser, something that had recognized in Connor a bridge between worlds. She called Ethan, who drove through the night to be there. Together, they stood with Connor at the door of the cabin. The bears had moved closer, forming a protective circle. The largest, a grizzly that might have been the offspring of the original, approached slowly. Connor walked to meet it, his small hand touching its massive head without fear. Then he turned back to Lily and Ethan. "I'll be back before the first snow," he promised. "They'll keep me safe. They've been keeping me safe all along." And with that, he walked into the forest, the bears forming around him like a living shield, their forms disappearing into the shadows between the trees. What followed were the longest 3 months of Lily's life. She stayed at the cabin, knowing somehow that Connor would return there. Ethan stayed too, taking leave from his work, understanding that this was another chapter in the story that had begun 8 years ago. They waited, they watched, they trusted in something that had no rational basis for trust. Sometimes, late at night, they could hear the humming in the distance, carried on the wind like a promise. Once, they found tracks in the snow, a circle of different-sized paws around a small human footprint, proof that Connor was still walking, still protected. The world outside continued its chaos, its conflicts, its forgetting of the miraculous. But in that cabin in Montana, 2 people held vigil for a child who had gone to learn something from the wild that no human institution could teach. They didn't speak much about what he might be learning, what purpose this served. Some things were too large for words, too important for speculation. They simply waited, trusted, and listened to the forest for signs of return. As autumn progressed and the leaves turned gold and red, other animals began to gather. Not just bears this time, but elk and wolves, eagles and ravens, even a mountain lion that sat at the edge of the clearing for 3 days before disappearing. It was as if the entire ecosystem was participating in whatever was happening with Connor, as if his education was a matter of importance to all living things. Ethan documented what he could, but mostly he just watched, understanding that he was witnessing something that might be the most important event of his lifetime. Then, exactly as promised, just before the first snow, Connor returned. He walked out of the forest as naturally as if he had been gone for an afternoon rather than 3 months. He was taller, stronger, his eyes holding even more of that ancient knowledge. The bears accompanied him to the edge of the clearing, but came no further. Connor turned and bowed to them, the same gesture they had made years ago, and they returned it before melting back into the forest. When he reached Lily, he hugged her with a strength that surprised her, and she could smell the forest on him, pine and earth and something wild that would never quite wash away. He didn't speak about where he had been for 3 days. When he finally did, the words came slowly, carefully, as if he was translating from that other language, the one of rumbles and harmonics. He spoke of caves where bears had denned for thousands of years, where the walls held memories in ways human minds couldn't quite grasp. He spoke of being taught to listen to the earth itself, to feel the connections between all living things as physical sensations rather than abstract concepts. He spoke of a responsibility he had been given, though he couldn't quite articulate what it was, only that it involved being a bridge, a translator between worlds that had forgotten how to speak to each other. The bears never gathered in such numbers again, but Connor's connection to them remained. As he grew into adolescence and then young adulthood, he found ways to use what they had taught him. He became a mediator in conflicts between human development and wildlife habitats, somehow always finding solutions that both sides could accept. He could track animals that had been thought extinct, leading to conservation efforts that saved entire species. He wrote papers on animal cognition that challenged established science, backing them with observations that couldn't be replicated but couldn't be dismissed. But more than his public work, there were the private moments, the times when he would disappear into the wilderness for days, returning with knowledge of environmental changes that wouldn't be detected by instruments for months. The way sick or injured animals would find their way to him, sometimes traveling impossible distances. The dreams he had that weren't quite dreams, visions of a world where the boundary between human and nature had healed, where the ancient contracts had been renewed. He shared these visions carefully, understanding that too much too fast would be dismissed as fantasy. Lily watched her son grow into his purpose with a mixture of pride and loss. He was human, but he was also something more, something the bears had recognized and nurtured. She understood that he belonged to the world in a way that most children didn't, that his life would always be pulled between the human world he was born into and the natural world that had claimed him. But she also saw the joy in him when he returned from his wilderness journeys, the peace in his eyes when he sat at the window humming those impossible harmonies. Ethan continued to document Connor's life, understanding that he was witnessing something that might be crucial for humanity's future. The world was changing, climate shifting, species disappearing, the connections between human and nature fraying to the breaking point. But Connor represented something else, a possibility that the damage could be healed, that communication could be reestablished, that the bear's gift to one small child could ripple outward in ways that might save everything. He didn't publish most of what he documented, understanding that some truths had to wait for their time. When Connor was 25, something changed in the world. Mass animal migrations began happening globally, not just bears this time, but hundreds of species, all moving with the same purposeful coordination. Scientists were baffled, governments were concerned, people were frightened. But Connor understood. He had been preparing for this his whole life, though he hadn't known it. The animals were responding to something, a call that humans couldn't hear, but that Connor had been taught to understand. They were moving away from areas that would soon be uninhabitable, toward places that could sustain them through the changes that were coming. He became a translator then, in the truest sense, not translating words but intentions, helping humanity understand that the animals weren't fleeing randomly, but following an ancient wisdom about survival. He worked with governments and conservation groups, helping establish corridors for the migrations, protecting the gathering places, ensuring that the movement could happen without conflict. It was exhausting work, requiring him to be in a dozen places at once, to speak to people who didn't want to listen, to bridge worlds that had been separate for too long. But he wasn't alone. In every place he went there were bears. Sometimes visible, sometimes just their presence felt, but always there. They were his network, his informants, his protectors. Through them, He could sense what was happening across continents, could understand patterns that satellite imagery couldn't detect. The gift they had given him as an infant had grown into something that connected him to the entire living web of the planet. It was overwhelming at times, feeling so much, knowing so much, being responsible for so much. During this time, he met others like himself. Not many, but a few. Children who had been recognized by different species, taught by wolves or dolphins or elephants, each carrying a piece of knowledge that humanity had lost. They found each other through dreams and instinct, forming a network of bridges between worlds. Together, they worked to prepare humanity for what was coming. Not apocalypse, but transformation. Not ending, but evolution. The animals knew something humans had forgotten, that survival wasn't about dominance, but about connection. Not about controlling nature, but about being part of it. The work was slow, often frustrating. For every person who listened, there were hundreds who dismissed Connor and others like him as delusional. But gradually, things began to change. Wildlife corridors were established that followed the migration patterns. Cities began incorporating green spaces that served as waypoints for traveling animals. Laws were passed that recognized animal cognition in ways that would have been laughable decades before. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was a beginning. Connor returned to the cabin in Montana often, needing the silence and the forest to restore himself. Lily still lived there, older now, but still strong, still maintaining the space where it had all begun. They would sit together on the porch, watching the forest, occasionally seeing a bear in the distance, checking, always checking. She would ask him if he ever regretted the path his life had taken, the weight he carried. He would smile and hum those harmonies the bears had taught him, and she would have her answer. When Connor was 30, the event everyone had been unconsciously waiting for finally happened. Climate change had reached a tipping point. Storms of unprecedented fury, droughts that killed millions, floods that reshaped coastlines. Humanity was forced to acknowledge what the animals had known was coming. But because of Connor and others like him, because of the networks they had established, the connections they had fostered, there was communication between species that allowed for coordinated response. Animals led humans to water sources that satellites couldn't detect. Birds warned of storms hours before technology registered them. Bears, those patient, powerful beings, guided refugees through mountain passes that maps said were impassable. It wasn't salvation in the traditional sense. There was still suffering, still loss, still the consequences of decades of ignoring the warning signs. But there was also cooperation on a scale that had never been seen before. Not since the days of myth when humans and animals were said to speak the same language. Connor was at the center of much of it, translating, mediating, teaching humans to hear what had always been there to hear. He aged quickly during those years, the weight of being a bridge taking its toll. But he never stopped, never stepped back from the responsibility the bears had given him. One winter, when Connor was 35, he had a dream that wasn't a dream. All the bears he had ever known were there, the ones from his infancy, the ones who had taught him in the forest, the ones who had been his distant guardians all his life. They were in a great circle, humming that harmony that had started everything. In the center was not Connor but a child, a little girl with eyes that held the same ancient wisdom Connor's had shown as an infant. The bears were choosing again, recognizing another bridge, ensuring that the connection wouldn't end with one person. He woke knowing what he had to do. He found the child, living in a small town in Alaska, her parents confused by her behavior, the way animals gathered around their home, the sounds she made that weren't quite human. Connor explained, as much as could be explained, helped them understand that their daughter was special in ways that would shape the future. He taught her what the bears had taught him, prepared her for the journey she would have to take. And when the time came, when the bears gathered for her as they had for him, he stood with her parents and helped them let go, helped them trust. The cycle continued. More children were recognized, more bridges were built. The world was changing, had to change, and these children were part of that change. They were evolution in real time, not biological but consciousness evolution, the recognition that human and nature were not separate, but part of the same living system. Connor watched it happening with satisfaction and exhaustion in equal measure. His work wasn't done, would never be done, but it was no longer his alone to do. When he was 40, Connor returned to the cabin for what he somehow knew would be the last time. Lily was very old now, but still there, still keeping watch. They sat together as they always had, but this time the forest was full of eyes. Every bear for miles had come, sitting in their patient circles, humming their ancient songs. Mother and son listened together, understanding that something was ending and beginning simultaneously. When the sun set, the humming grew louder, and Connor felt the call he had been expecting his whole life. He kissed his mother goodbye, knowing she understood, knowing she had always known this moment would come. He walked into the forest, into the circle of bears, and they closed around him with the same protective formation they had shown when he was 8. But this time, he wasn't coming back, not in the same way. He was going to become something else, something that could better serve the purpose he had been born for. The last thing Lily saw was her son's silhouette against the darkening sky, surrounded by the beings who had shaped his destiny, disappearing into the mystery that had begun with a baby's cry and a global migration. Years later, when scientists tried to explain the unprecedented cooperation between species that had helped humanity survive its darkest period, they would point to various factors: climate pressure, evolutionary adaptation, mutual benefit. But those who had been there, who had seen Connor work, who had witnessed the gatherings, knew differently. They knew that sometimes evolution wasn't gradual but sudden, not biological but conscious, not individual but collective. They knew that a baby's cry had indeed stopped a global bear migration, that the bears had turned around to help, and that help had rippled outward in ways that saved not just one child, but possibly the entire interconnected web of life on Earth. The cabin still stands in Montana, maintained by people who understand its significance. Sometimes bears still gather there, smaller numbers now, but with the same patient watchfulness. Sometimes, if you know how to listen, you can hear the humming on the wind, the ancient song that speaks of connections that transcend species, of bridges that can't be broken, of a love that encompasses all living things. And sometimes, very rarely, visitors report seeing a figure at the edge of the forest, neither fully human nor fully bear, watching over the place where it all began, ensuring that the story continues, that the bridges remain strong, that the gift given to one small child continues to ripple outward, healing the ancient wound between human and nature, one connection at a time.